My name is Amir Fillet, and I wanted to know what happens if you don't listen to God's calling.
Ooh.
Your turn to start off in that one. She looks like she knows what she's talking about.
I don't know about that. That's a great question, and I love that she is thinking about what God is calling her to and trying to really hear where God is calling her. What happens if you don't listen to God's calling? My first instinct is that it's really hard to miss the calling of God. That comes from my own experience of trying to run away from my calling into ministry for a full decade. I think that there are things that are always challenging. When God is calling us forward, whether that is impacts our entire career, whether that impacts our family, whether that impacts how we use our time on the weekends. Whenever God is calling us, there is this fear and I feel trepidation, but often God calls us to things that we need his help to complete. So there's always this challenge involved in following God's call. But I do think that God chases after us with a relentless pursuit, that we cannot outrun God's plan for our lives. As I think about, I remember saying no to a calling to ministry in college and pursued another career, and I learned a lot and grew a lot and even moved across the country to Houston. And even here, God called me into ministry, that we cannot outrun the voice of God. So I think that we can delay, but I really believe that God is gracious and relentless in the ways that he continually brings us to that same point until I think it was Charles, my utmost for his highest. Who wrote that? Can you remind me?
Yeah,
Oswald,
Oswald,
not
yeah.
Charles Spurgeon. Oswald, thank you. Oh, you read it too, so you know how really difficult his words are. He has one of his days, he talks about how when we don't obey God's call or when we don't surrender, that he'll continually bring us back to that point until we surrender. That it's almost this like graciously allowing us to return until we come to this point where we are able to actually lay down and surrender. And that has been my experience of God's call, that we can't really outrun it and that God will graciously put it right in front of us until we surrender to that calling.
I find it interesting as I talk with people will come in and want to visit or have one of the one-on-ones that I mentioned earlier. And I have seen grown men cry because they knew they had a calling for a particular ministry early on in their life, and they just kept right on going. They didn't heed the call. They kept trying to run from it, like she said. And now they were older, have arrived at a place in their life where they're older. And the guilt and the pain has just mounted up inside of them. And they say, what can I do? I know one man in particular was just so teary because he felt like he missed the call. And we looked at things that maybe he could do at his age that would help. It wasn't the exact thing he was called to, but that would help him live that out. And you know, he went and did that, and he just feels greatly satisfied. So here's what I think. I think we each are a piece of a gigantic jigsaw puzzle. And each one of us have certain gifts and talents, and we are called by God to help make that piece of the puzzle fit into the overall picture of what he's doing on earth. And our piece may be little, it may be one of those really big pieces, but how wonderful to know at the end of our life that we placed our piece of the puzzle in the picture. And think of what it will look like if we don't put our piece of the puzzle there. It's missing. It's not complete. But every one of you are unique and gifted differently. And when you accept Jesus, you get spiritual gifts. So I would just say to you, just think Pray, listen, ask your friends, what do you think my calling might be? And how can I live out that calling? And then don't be afraid. Just jump in and do it, because one thing I think Caitlin and I have learned, that when God calls you to something, He will be with you. He will see you through to the end, and you can count on that.
I think that's perfect. I think that that is a great analogy for what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 12. I think that one of the things that grieves my heart about how we have allowed the church to be set up in the 21st century is that we really believe that people who are called to full-time ministry are the only ones called into ministry. And 1 Corinthians 12 is so clear that absolutely every single part of the body of Christ has a calling and has been given gifts that are meant to be used for the edification and the building up of the body. And I think there's great consequence when we don't use the gifts that we have been entrusted with. It's like what happens if the spleen stops functioning or if the gallbladder stops functioning in the human body. There are very real consequences when even just one part of the body stops functioning in a healthy way. And so I think that this calling, we have often thought about it in individual terms, which is true. We are individuals with lives that matter, but there are also great communal ramifications for whether or not we say yes to the ways that God is calling us to use our gifts.
I think that, and I've read this a lot over the years, but it's like we die and we go to heaven. And God is not going to say to you, what kind of a car did you drive? How many trips did you go on? What was your job? How prestigious was your job? The words that may come from His lips are, what did you do with what I gave you? So think about that. What did you do with what I gave you? And there is absolutely no age limit on this. We had a woman in the church. She has passed away. Her gift was hospitality and building up people. And she wrote countless notes over her years to people in ministry at all kinds of different churches. And even when she was bedridden, she still knew that that was her calling, that that's what she was supposed to do. And she wrote up until the day she died. She lived out her calling.